Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Enlightenment, Part 1, in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. I'd like to begin with Sabbatai Zevi. He's a Jewish person from Smyrna, modern day Izmir, located in western Turkey. Um, the eschatology of the day looked to have the return of Jesus, among Christians at least. Christian authors thought that Jesus would return in 1666. I wonder if they were using that dating method by that time. I'm wondering if they had the number 666 and thought, gee, that's Book of Revelation. Um, and Zevi uh, bounced on that. The Zohar interpreted 1948 as the year of redemption. That's a book of Jewish mysticism. So, among both Christians and Jews, they were looking for something spectacular to happen. And Zevi declared himself to be the Messiah, 1648, that same year. So he said, see, um, our Jewish mystical books, the Zohar, that's not the Bible. Those are other writings much later. They said something special is going to happen, and here I am. Well, he moves to Jerusalem. After all, that's where you would think the Messiah would be. And one of his followers claimed to be Elijah. So you've got the coming of Elijah. Remember, there's a prophecy in Malachi that before the Lord comes, Elijah will come first. Of course, Jesus pointed out that John the Baptist filled that role nicely. Um, well, he began to really develop popularity throughout Europe and gained some notoriety. He was arrested in Constantinople. Now, remember, Constantinople had in 1453 been conquered by the Muslims, and now it was a important Muslim city, still is today. And he was arrested there and converted to Islam on threat of death. Either you'll convert or you'll die, and he chose to convert. So he wasn't. But that sort of showed to everybody, okay, Messiah, he's not that. Now, on the Christian front, John Bunyan, around this time, 1678, writes Pilgrim's Progress. Bunyan is actually writing this from prison. I remember in the 1600s, you'd had the sort of the sway of religious groups going from Charles the First to the Commonwealth to Charles the Second, and Bunyan's caught up in that, and he's arrested. And the story, it tells of a dream sequence, and in the dream, it's actually an allegory, a very obvious allegory. You don't have to look very far to make the connections. He does that with the names of people and the names of different locations where they go. It's really two stories. The first story is the journey of someone named Christian. You can tell what he represents. He represents a Christian, and then he's at the beginning. He's carrying this heavy burden, and he comes to the cross, and the burden is released. And you can sort of tell what is describing somebody coming to Jesus. But that really begins his pilgrimage as he's going to his final destination, the celestial city, in other words, heaven. And at the end, it's all the adventures that he has on the way, the temptations, the trials, the difficulties, and at the end, there's a giant river that he has to cross, and he struggles across, representing death, going from this life to the next, and it's such a horrendous struggle, and finally he's crossed, and that's the end of the first story. The second story then picks up, and it's the journey of Christiana. In other words, Mrs. Christian, um, and her travels take her along sometimes the same route, sometimes a different route, different people that she meets along the way. And you get to the end of the story, and she crosses the river, but there's no struggle. It's a very peaceful crossing. The picture of somebody who died very peacefully and gently, and so you're struck by the difference between the two. The locations in the story, it starts off the city of destruction. In other words, the worldly city, the world without Jesus, and then there's the slough of despond, as once he's come to Christ, but now he's coming through difficulty and just weighed down by things. The wicked gate, passing, up to that point, He's been hearing the gospel, but still carrying his burden, and now he passes through, and the burden is cast aside. He comes to Vanity Fair, where there are people claiming to be pilgrims that are followers of Jesus, but they've been sort of pulled aside by this pleasure or that pleasure. There's Doubting Castle, and finally, we already talked about the river of death. And of course, their goal is the celestial city to finally get to the presence of the Lord, and that's the goal of the pilgrimage. Now, John Amos Comenius, he's a Moravian Brethren pastor in the tradition of John Huss. Remember, John Huss goes 100 years before the Reformation, sort of a pre-Reformation reformer who was burned at the stake. And he adopts what he calls his pansophy. That is the integration, that's the pan part, it just means all, the integration of all knowledge with the Christian faith. This idea, if I can just bring everything together and then I'll know everything and see how it balances out with my Christianity. Writes a series of pictorial textbooks that are given over to, because of the pictures, remember, not everybody can read and write, so it's going to communicate nicely to all sorts of people. And he's asked actually to be the president of Harvard. Um, he, um, so he has considerable influence. He's looked up to as a leader. He says, "We are all citizens of one world. We are all of one blood. To hate a man because he was born in another country, because he speaks a different language, or because he takes on a different view on this subject or that, is a great folly." In other words, this is that Moravian ideal. Yes, we might have some different ideas in our Christianity, but let's all love each other. Let's have the love of Christ constrain us. Let me just say, I teach at a Bible college where that sort of ideal is very much in evidence. It's um, I started to say non-denominational. Actually, it's an interdenominational Bible college in the sense that we have people, myself included, from a number of different Christian denominations, all evangelical. We all hold to the gospel. There are some truths that we see as evident, and yet there's quite a bit of distinction in what we think of as maybe important issues, but still minor compared to the gospel, minor compared to who God is, and we're able to teach together in a wonderful way. It's actually it's a wonderful ministry, and it captures this thinking right here. He advocates a public school system that would be available for both rich and poor. And again, the Bible college where I teach, one of the things that it's about is trying to make education, Christian education, but also general education too, on the college level, affordable to everyone. And that's really our goal. It's been one of the things that the college started out to do, and has kept and held on to that idea of graduating students. And the ideal, perhaps we don't always get there, but we really do try hard to graduate students who are debt free, who don't owe a ton of money and then have to work that off. That can So this can be a ladder of success, not an anchor that drags them down. He sought to invent a universal language. That was quite ambitious. It obviously didn't catch on. Next, I want to talk about Richard Baxter. We mentioned him earlier, an English Puritan pastor. He gets into a friendly debate with John Owen, Baptist pastor, over the issue of particular atonement. Owen um, is not in favor of that. Baxter is, and they're arguing the issue, and they write back and forth. He declines the chaplaincy under Cromwell. Remember how Cromwell brings about the Commonwealth, and Baxter is offered that position. He's very popular as a preacher, as a pastor, but no, he doesn't want to do that. And after this, is forbidden to preach. Not so much by Cromwell, I don't believe, but afterwards when Charles II comes to the throne. He writes his book, The Reformed Pastor, and we've mentioned that before. We actually had some quotes in it in a previous class. He says, "Study hard, for the well is deep, and our brains are shallow." He has a way with words, and certainly makes a. He says, lay siege to your sins and starve them out by keeping away the food and fuel, which is their maintenance and life. Again, a good point. Don't give the enemy an open door into your soul. He says, preaching a man a sermon with a broken head and telling him to be right with God is equal to telling a man with a broken leg to get up and run a race. That is, that sometimes you have to address the mind as well as the heart. Sometimes you have to address the body as well as the heart. He says you're likely to see no general reformation till you procure family reformation. And he actually practiced what he preached. He would actually visit all of the people in his congregation, visit all the families. Yeah, very big on that. Some little obscure religion there may be here and there, one, but while it sticks in single persons and is not promoted by these societies, it doth not prosper nor promise much for future increase. You need to see families come together, not just an individual, but families come together and follow the Lord. The family unit is the unit that will see lasting reformation and, more important, lasting spirituality. Now, switching over to the political arena, and I'm speaking right now more of France. You have in France three estates, and we're going to talk more about this next time. I want to introduce it right now. The first estate was the clergy. These are sort of I sort of want to call them the decision-making bodies, but this doesn't mean that they had no kings. It means that sometimes when it came time to pay taxes and pass laws, these would be the folks involved. So the first estate was the clergy. The second estate was the nobility, and the third estate, and they call that sometimes the nobility of the sword. And there was also the nobility of the robe. So you had both of those that owned the property and those that fought for the property, the sword and the robe. And then the third estate was everyone else, the commoners, the merchants, of course, peasants technically were represented, but not really. It was you would think like the working people. So the people that were in the cities, both the urban people in the um, this was the era of the divine right of kings. This had been taught going all the way back to the Middle Ages, where you have God, and then, of course, under the Roman Catholic system, they said, well, the Pope is his representative, and then remember how the Pope had placed the crown on Charlemagne's head. See, the Pope makes the king, or in that case, it was the emperor, and then the king rules over everybody else. Now, what's beginning to happen, because we've had popes that didn't have quite the same um, ability to control things. They didn't have quite the same political connections. They'd been sometimes. Remember, we had the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, where it had been moved to Avignon, and then you have French that are involved in choosing the pope. So what you have is, yes, the Pope, but he's sort of moved aside. And now the kings are saying, wait a minute, Romans chapter 13 doesn't say anything about popes. It says God has appointed kings and rulers. So, yes, the Pope's there, but he's not in the quote unquote chain of command. There's God and then there's the king. And the one who exemplifies that is going to be Louis the 14th. Now, the question had been floated: does a king have a responsibility to his kingdom? And there were those that were saying, even some monarchs had been saying, yes, it's almost as though there is a covenant, an agreement between the people and the king that, yes, the king's going to rule, but he's going to rule in a way that's beneficial to his people, to his kingdom. In a sense, he'd say that the state is there not just as the possession of the king, but for the king, in a sense, can we say it this way, to serve. I mentioned Louis the 14th of France, known as the Sun King. He takes that conversation. He says, "The state, l'état, c'est moi. The state, it is I. I'm the state. I'm serving me, and everybody else just sort of belongs to me." Uh, and he's known as the king who was the most absolute monarch in Europe during this era. Other kings after him are going to say, "Gee, I'd like to be like Louis XIV." They're not going to cut it. Let me just say. He revokes the Edict of Nantes. Remember the edict that allowed um, the reformers to live in France and to worship as long as it was private and not in the city of Paris. They could be out in the country. Well, he revokes that. He says, no, you can't worship anywhere. You have to worship the way I say to worship. You have to be good Roman Catholics. And so Huguenots are denied their freedom now, and 200,000 Huguenots are going to flee France. In fact, we're not going to use the term Huguenot after this because Huguenot's a French term, speaking of those French Protestants, French sometimes, well, usually we'd think of them as the Calvinists, the Reformed French, and there won't be any that were living in France. They're going to move to other places, and after a while, we're not going to think of them as French. They may have a French background, but that's going to be virtually the end of the Huguenot movement. Now, Louis XIV is going to be center stage when Charles II of Spain dies with no heir. And Louis says, well, my grandson can be king of Spain, and we'll just make Spain and France a single nation, and everybody will be happy. We'll be the mightiest nation in the world, in Europe, and in the rest of the world. Well, everybody else is going to say, no, that's not going to happen. England and the Netherlands and Austria and the German nobles, no, absolutely not. And the Emperor of Austria said, "Well, I can unite Austria with Spain." There was some family connections there, and again, that's going to be no, it's not going to happen. But finally, what does happen is that the grandson of Louis XIV will be king of Spain, but it's going to be agreed that it will be two separate nations. So we're going to have France and Spain, and they'll continue to be separate and distinct. Sometimes they'll be at war, sometimes they'll be at peace, but they'll be two different nations, even to this day. Um, but it's Louis XIV's grandson who's now king of Spain. And of course, you're probably not going to fight your grandfather, so there's going to be a time of peace between Spain and France, at least for a time, until you get a few generations down. And everybody goes along with that. Even the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who had been hoping that maybe he could, get a seat there. Now, art and the Enlightenment. The Roman Catholics, when it came to art forms, embraced a number of different art forms. Of course, this goes all the way back to the senior moment here. The Second Council of Nicaea. The Second Council of Nicaea had been that location. That remember, the First Council of Nicaea had been back in the 300s. That's right after Constantine comes on the scene. The Second Council of Nicaea, 800 A.D., had said yes to icons. There'd been a question there, icons isn't that a little bit like idolatry? You're reverencing images and pictures and statues and kissing them, and the Roman Catholic Church, actually both Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, had said icons are good. Well, the Lutherans came along, and they did utilize some art forms within the church, although they said, don't be bowing down to it, don't be worshiping, but they continued to use that. They felt it hadn't been specifically forbidden in the New Testament. Calvinists would argue with them over that. For example, 1 John chapter 5, and the last verse in the whole book ends, flee idolatry. Is that idolatry or not? Well, that's the disagreement. And Calvinists rejected religious art as being idolatrous in Christian worship. So they said, no art within the church. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have any artists, you can't have any art, but we're not going to put it in the church. So if you go into a church that comes from Calvinist roots, you're not going to see much in the way of art forms. No pictures of Jesus, no statues. In fact, most evangelical churches, you won't see that sort of thing either. Now, that's going to lead increasingly to secular subjects in art. If we're not going to be painting biblical topics, especially, remember, we're not going to try to paint God. And we might, in the secular realm have religious paintings, but secular realm isn't usually that interested. Usually, it's the religious pictures. You say, well, they belong in a religious place, like a church. So this is going to lead to increasingly secular subjects in the world of art. Now, back in the Renaissance, remember that was from the 1400s to the 1500s, and now we've come into the Enlightenment era, that is from the 1600s to the 1700s, and admittedly, I'm painting with a very, excuse the pun, I'm painting with a very broad brush. The Renaissance had looked back to the Greek and Roman classics, sort of the rediscovery of that, the humanists going back to the source, and they saw that, and that's wonderful. The Enlightenment folks, both thinkers and artists, looked to science and philosophy, and in a sense, they were looking to the present and to the future, a forward looking instead of a backward looking. With the Renaissance, there was a strong Christian presupposition. With the Enlightenment, there are some that still hold to that, but increasingly there's a tendency toward deism. Now, deism is the belief that there is a God somewhere, the one who created the universe, but he's not necessarily here or knowable. He created everything and then he went on a long vacation and he hasn't been back since. And and so deism, we're going to see a lot of deists, both in Europe and in the Americas. A number of the early presidents of the United States were deists in their outlook. Um, and so versus the Christian presupposition of the Renaissance. Renaissance began, of course, in Italy and then gradually had influence other places in Europe. Enlightenment thinkers, art and science, started primarily in France and England. The chief thinkers, the chief ones involved, are going to be involved there. You will have Enlightenment artists down in Italy. Um, in the Renaissance, it was all about the divine right of kings. That spills over into the early part of the Enlightenment. But now we're going to see a discussion about the rights of man. We'll see that especially in our part 2 section next time when we look at the Enlightenment part 2. The Renaissance led to the Reformation. The Enlightenment led to an age of revolution. Now let's look at art, Baroque art, and the term Baroque actually has the idea of something that is irregular. It's actually a term that's used for jewelry, and sometimes you might have a pearl, but it's not perfectly round, so it's Baroque. It has sort of an irregular shape. Um, and the art form, very dramatic. Here's an example. This is showing the Call of Matthew. Now notice they're dressed like people that were in the 1600s rather than dressed like people that were in the first century. I'm not sure if they even knew how the people in the first century dressed, so they just put it into their own era. Very rich color, very intense light. Now, how do you make light in a painting intense? It's by contrasting it with the dark. So there's dark shadows, but very, very light. The whole painting isn't dark. Another painting, this is entitled The Crown of Thorns, and in both of these, it's almost like it's stopped action. You can see the action that's involved. Again, the way the soldiers dress, he's dressed like someone who's in the 1600s, not in the first century. They may not have known the difference. A third painting, The Incredulity of Saint Thomas. And of course, you know the picture, you know the story where Jesus, after his resurrection, he appears first to a number of disciples, but then a week later, Thomas is there who hadn't seen the risen Jesus, and it said, "I won't believe unless I put my finger, my hands into into the nail prints of his hands and put my finger into his side." And Jesus shows up and says, "Take a look," and you can almost hear that happening in this painting, the way they've captured it. And finally, the entry of animals into Noah's Ark, almost like a nature scene. You say, "Well, where's the ark?" It's not. It's not even pictured that I see it. It's more of a way just to show a bunch of animals, and so it's a study in nature almost. Now, and so far we're looking at all religious themes. We're not going to look right now at secular themes. Renaissance art, we're going to put them side by side where you can see the difference. It introduced perspective. I think the Mona Lisa, remember how you see her up front and then you can see the background, but failed to capture emotions. At least uh, that wasn't the big thing. In Baroque art, it's going to focus on drama and emotions. It's almost like a stop action. It's like watching a sports event. Just as the football player catches the football, it's like capturing the action right there. In Renaissance art, it's all about order and rationalism and nature and symmetry. And in Baroque, it's not about symmetry. It's emotional, it's ornate, yes, it's dramatic, dynamic, and asymmetrical. Again, that irregular idea, which is the very meaning of the French word Baroque. Now, let's look at some specific examples. Here's Michelangelo's David. Certainly a beautiful art form, perfectly muscular, looks, very dramatic. And yet, if you want drama, look by contrast. This is also a picture of David, but in this case, you can see what David is doing. In the first, in Michelangelo's David, he's just standing there. He's got the sling sort of over his shoulder. In the Baroque, he's just thrown that rock. The sling has just left his hand, or at least the rock has left the sling, and you can see where he's wound. He's thrown his arm through, and he's waiting for the rock to hit. Of course, Goliath, who's not the focus of the sculpture, but it's telling a story. Here is the Madonna and Child, Mary and Jesus, very again symmetrical. You see the background. Here's another picture, Baroque. Um, Notice the dark and the light, very contrasting. And in this case, you can see the expressions. They're at rest. They're not just sitting there posing for the picture. Um, a very different way of telling the story. A Renaissance art piece with Jesus upon the cross, and you have the two Marys, Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary, on either side, almost like they've taken their place, very stylized. And then for a Baroque treatment of the same event, notice it's not Jesus just hanging on the cross; they're bringing the body down, the lifeless body. And everything's not balanced, and the picture actually flows down toward the bottom of the canvas as the body is being gently and reverently, but it's being lowered. And you know, there's a certain there's an attention to the irregular shape as it moves down from the cross. Finally, here's the story of Jesus and the two disciples on the Emmaus Road. They've stopped for dinner. Notice how they're placed. They're on either side of Jesus, very nice and, almost like they've been posed. On either side, you have someone who's either serving or waiting upon them. A Baroque treatment of the same event. Here we've got the two disciples, but notice the difference in expression. It's very, very dramatic, very emotional expression. The hands are out, the faces. Um, there is one person, but only one person, sort of off to the side listening in, and he's just intent. He's not just a bystander. He's listening in to what's going on. In our closing few minutes, I'd like to talk just briefly about philosophy and the Enlightenment, and really want to talk about just one particular philosopher who in a sense sets the stage for the Enlightenment. Um, the humanists, remember we talked about the Renaissance humanists had been all about the rediscovery of the Greek and Roman classics, and let's go back to the source. Let's go back to Greece and Rome and hear what the philosophers have to say. By contrast, the Enlightenment thinkers had rejected the Greek and Roman classics. They said they have nothing to teach us. We're not looking back. We want to look forward. Forward. We want to go forward with modern science and modern philosophy and new ideas. And that's exemplified especially in the person of Voltaire. It wasn't actually his name. We know him by that. Francis Marie Arouet. He adopted the pen name Voltaire after he had been arrested and incarcerated for a time. He actually seemed to have hated Christianity. Now, he didn't claim to be an atheist. I think probably a deist would be a better description of him, but he hated Christianity and doesn't seem to be all that have been all that fond of God. Blamed Christianity for the fall of Rome. In fact, someone else who lived and wrote just a bit after him, their lifetimes were at the same time, was Ernest Gibbons, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Blamed also blamed Christianity for the decline and fall of Rome. He said the problem with Rome is they became Christian and then they fell. Which when you say that, you say, wait a minute, the western part of the Roman Empire fell. What about the eastern part that continued for another 1,000 years? Gibbons just saw that as not all that important. He claimed that the deity of Christ was a later invention, that Jesus never claimed to be divine. I think when you read the words of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels, you see a very different picture. His famous statement, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Now, when he says that, he's saying that both Christianity and the belief in God do play an important role in society. He did recognize that, whether he liked it or not. Um, so he's commenting on that, not being that he's positive about that, but that yes, he saw some good, that just the idea of God, the fact that God says, I'm going to judge, and so people want to act better as a result of that. Um, he denied the Adam and Eve story and believed different races had different origins, so that the Europeans or people with white skin came from one source, and people, sort of sort of evolution, independent evolution. He would have called for. Um, and then black people, they had another origin and another beginning. They didn't see all of humanity as necessarily being related to each other. Christianity, he says, is the most ridiculous, the most absurd and bloody religion that has ever infected the world. Um, I would I would propose to him that yes, there have been problems with Christians doing some things that they shouldn't have done. But I would propose to him that he needed to, both what came before him and especially what came after him. We're going to see a number of very bloody wars, in some cases, civil wars, and in some cases, internal conflicts that will have nothing to do with Christianity. Actually, religious atheist countries that will kill millions and millions. His statement has been his statement has been, I think, nullified. And a prophecy that he makes, he made the comment. He says, "In 100 years from my day, there will not be a Bible in the earth except the one that's looked upon by an antiquarian curiosity seeker." It's interesting that about 100 years later, after his death, that his house, at least certain rooms of his house, were being used by a Bible society to print Bibles. To this day, the Bible is still a bestseller throughout the world. So his prophecy, he was a false prophet, and very wrong in what he had to say.